In our previous lesson, I showed you how to implement integration tests for our REST API. We used test containers to spin up a Postgres instance that was running using the Web Application Factory, and this is an abstraction provided by a Microsoft testing library. This allows us to spin up the DevHabit REST API as an in-memory instance, and we can send proper HTTP requests to this in-memory instance. The request will go through the entire request pipeline before we get back an HTTP response. Now, this is just testing our REST API together with a database, but in isolation of any external services. However, we do depend on an external service, the GitHub REST API, for some of the functionality within the DevHabit application, and in this lesson I want to show you how to properly test this. When it comes to testing external services that you don't own, such as the GitHub REST API, or if we were building a microservices system, these would be services from the other teams. We want to resort to mocking these services in some way. There's a very popular library called WireMock that allows you to do this, and it works by allowing you to create an HTTP server that you can configure to process your incoming requests. And instead of sending the HTTP requests to the GitHub REST API, we're going to send it to the WireMock server. The server is going to process our request, so we are actually sending an HTTP request. However, we control what is the response that we get back. So this is how we can mock our external services for integration testing. Now let me show you how we're going to implement this. We're going to start by installing the WireMock NuGet package. So let me look for WireMock, and the library that I want to install is wiremock.net. And let me go ahead and install the latest version. So now that we have WireMock installed, we need to set up a WireMock server. I'll do that inside of the DevHabit Web Application Factory, and I'll define a private read-only field specifying my WireMock server instance, and let's give it a name. So now that I have my WireMock server, inside of initialize async, I'm going to say WireMock server, and I'm going to assign WireMock server start. Of course, I have to get rid of the read-only value here to be able to actually set this. And inside of this pose async, I'm going to say WireMock server, and we're going to stop our server instance and perform the cleanup. Then I want to expose this to my test fixture, and I'm going to create a method that lets me return the WireMock server. And one more thing I need to do here is define a configuration value that I can use to reference the WireMock server address. So I'll create a configuration value called GitHub base URL, and I'm going to provide the value of WireMock server. I'll access the URLs property, and I'll get the first value. So now we have to make sure that we are using this configuration value when configuring our communication with the GitHub REST API. So for this, we'll have to jump into our project file, and I will open up the dependency injection class, and somewhere within the add application services method, let me find it here, you'll see us configuring the GitHub HTTP client in the GitHub API, which uses Refit. Now currently, we are hard-coding the base address of the GitHub API, which is going to prevent us from making this testable. So instead, what I have to do is say builder configuration, and I can provide the base address here by saying get section, specify the GitHub URL value, and then I'm going to extract a string from this address. Let's also do that when assigning the base URI for my Refit client. So I'm just going to drop in this value. Now we do have to take care of properly setting this value when we are running in development. So inside of the app settings development JSON file, I'll create a respective section. Let's call it GitHub, and I'll define a base URL value that's going to point to the GitHub REST API. This way, when I run my application, it's going to use the correct address, and it's going to allow me to override the configuration value inside of my integration tests. So now I can close this down, and I can go back to my DevHabit Web App Factory, and we're actually done here. We've created our WireMock server, we call the respective start and stop method, and we also use the WireMock server URL to set the configuration value. So now we can proceed to writing our integration tests that are going to use the WireMock server. Inside of the test fixture, I'm going to define another helper method that's just going to allow me to obtain the WireMock server inside of my test cases, and then let me define my test class. I'll create a class and I'll call it GitHub tests, and we're going to be testing the functionality inside of the GitHub controller. So let's implement the integration test fixture. I'll define the base constructor, and I can go ahead and define my test case. Now the test setup will be a bit complicated, so I'm going to drop in some helper variables that I'll need. I'll define a constant to represent my GitHub access token that I will use inside of the tests. I'll also define a GitHub user profile DTO instance. I'll use this to represent the response from the user endpoint, and I'll define another one to represent the response of the events endpoint. So these are just some mock values that I'll be using inside of my test cases. One more thing I can do is define my routes for the GitHub controller. So let's specify a static class, let's call it GitHub, and my route names are store access token, the route is GitHub, and then personal access token. Then I'll define a route for getting the profile, which is GitHub/profile, and I'll introduce another route here, which I will call get events, and the route will be GitHub events. Now this endpoint doesn't exist yet, so I'm going to define it inside of the GitHub controller, and I'll scroll to the bottom and I'll drop in this new endpoint definition. It's very similar to the previous one, so it shouldn't be too hard for you to implement this, and it relies on already existing components. We're going to fetch the user's identifier, get the GitHub access token, fetch the user's profile so that we can access the login information for this user, and we'll call the getUserEvents async method until finally returning the events in the response. So this is also something that I want to cover in my test cases. So let me close everything down, and then let's head over to our GitHub tests. So my first test case will be trying to fetch the user's profile when I have a valid access token. So let's see how I can define this type of integration test. I'll say get profile should return user profile when access token is valid. Let me define the arrange, act, and assert steps, and then the arrange step is going to be the most complicated one. I'll start by accessing the WireMock server, and this is basically the most important part that I want to demonstrate here. What you can do here is define what's going to happen when the WireMock server receives a particular request. So you can say WireMock server given, and then you can start defining your request. So I can say request and be sure to access the one from the WireMock request builder's namespace. I'll say request create, and now I can start configuring my request. So I can say with path and specify the path of my request, which is the user endpoint on the GitHub REST API. Then I can specify any request headers. For example, we are specifying the authorization header with the value of bearer, and then we're passing in our access token value. You can also define which HTTP method you are using. In our case, this is the get method, and I'll define this by saying using get. Then I can define what the WireMock server should respond with using the respond with method. Similarly, I will access the response type, so I can create it, and then I can begin to define my response. So I'll say with status code, and I can specify which status code I want to use. I want to return 200 OK. I can optionally specify a response header. For example, I can specify the content type header, and for the value, I can use media type names application JSON. And then you can define your response body. Now, a common approach is to just say with body, and then you can define a JSON response inside. For example, I could define what is the login of the user, provide the login value, and this is a nice convention if you want to customize a JSON response. I'm going to say that I want to respond with body as JSON and specify my user instance that I defined as a static field. So this is most of what I need to configure WireMock. Then I'll need my HTTP client, and I'll obtain an authenticated client by calling the method that I defined in the previous lesson. And what I want to do here is first store the access token for the user. So I'll create a new store GitHub access token DTO, pass in my test access token, and when it expires, then I'll say await client post as JSON async. The route is routes GitHub store access token. I'll also pass in my DTO. If you want to, we could validate the response. I'm going to omit that. Then I'm going to say client get async, specify my route, and this is just accessing the user's profile. This will give me back an HTTP response message. I want to ensure that this is a success status code, and then I want to get the user's profile. So I'll say await response content, and in this case I want to read the content as a string value, and this is because I'm using the Newtonsoft JSON serializer. So I'll say JSON convert deserialize object specify the GitHub user profile DTO, and then the string value representing the JSON of my response. So this should give me back a user's profile, and then I want to assert that the profile object isn't null, first of all. And for example, I can also assert that it's equivalent to the one that I defined that should be returned from the WireMock server. So I can say that I'm expecting a GitHub user profile that matches the user static field that I defined, and I'll specify the profile that I got back from my REST API. So this type of test is already pretty complicated. The setup is quite cumbersome. We're setting up a mock server. We have to make sure that we have a proper access token present, and only then we can send our request, which is going to reach out to the GitHub API, but it's actually going to land on the WireMock server and give us back the response that we configured here. The end result should be that we get back a GitHub user profile DTO instance, and it should be the same one that we configured on the WireMock server. One small mistake I just spotted was using post as JSON async here. Instead, I should use put as JSON, otherwise we're going to get a method not allowed response. So now I should be able to run my test case, and assuming everything is wired up correctly, it should reach out to the WireMock server instead of the GitHub REST API, and we'll get back a proper response. So you can see my test case is passing. And this is how you can do integration testing for your external services using the WireMock library. I think this example should be enough to illustrate how we can use WireMock for integration testing our external services. In the next lesson, I'll try to give you a complete picture of what integration testing of REST API looks like by introducing many more test cases.